I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. We have guests with us this morning. We'd especially like to welcome you. On a morning when there were a whole lot of things you could have chosen to do, you've chosen to come and worship God. That not only does that speak very well of you, but that's very encouraging to all of us here. That there are people out there who will choose to worship God. They will put that above other things. This morning I'd like to talk a little bit about what do we do when life gets hard. Now, before we do this, I do want to make one disclaimer. As I'm sure pretty much all of you in here know, if you don't, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have a degree. This is not a sermon for people who are suffering from serious medical conditions. If you're here this morning and you are suffering, if you are suffering from clinical depression, from things such as that, this is not meant to be a sermon to tell you that you should quit going to the doctor. You should quit seeing whoever you are. In fact, if you are suffering from that, I would encourage you to do that. This is a sermon about the everyday kind of downs. The kind of days we have when we have really bad days. Maybe when we have really bad days is sometimes string out into a really bad week. I'm guessing most of us in here, if not all of us, have had those at times. That's what I want to talk about today. Those days when it feels like you can't do anything right, when nothing is going right, when you've messed up everything and you don't know what to do. My question is, does the Bible tell us anything about that? Can the Bible help us with those types of days? I believe it can. I believe it can because I believe we see that played out in the Bible. In the book of 1 Kings, chapter 19, we see Elijah. Now, Elijah had a problem. And Elijah's problem was actually what Victor just read for us in the scripture reading. See, Jezebel wanted Elijah dead. And if you know anything about your Old Testament history, you know Jezebel says she wants you dead. That's not an idle threat. This was a woman who was quite ready to kill. And she had now threatened the prophet of God. This man who is a prophet of God has now been threatened with death by the queen of God's people. So this is the situation that Elijah finds himself in. I guess the next question is, how does he get in that situation? Were we to go back a couple chapters, we'd actually have to start at chapter 17. Chapter 17 and 18, we see that Elijah has a very confrontational relationship with Ahab, who would be Jezebel's husband, the king. I guess you could say this comes to a head on Mount Carmel. There's a contest. 450 prophets of Baal, Jezebel's priests, I guess to say it, align on the mountain against Elijah. There is a contest. Altars are made. The priests of Baal scream and cry and pray to their God. They cut themselves. Nothing happens. Elijah builds an altar. He prays to the Lord. Fire comes down from heaven, destroys burns up the altar. The people then round up the prophets of Baal, 450 prophets, who Elijah then puts to death. This is a high point. The prophets of Baal have been destroyed. And then we get to chapter 19. Then we get to chapter 19 where Jezebel says, this time tomorrow you're going to be dead. And we see how Elijah reacts. In verse 3, he was scared. Now this makes sense to us. As I said, being threatened by Jezebel is not an idle threat. Elijah was scared. But Elijah wasn't just scared. If we go down to verse 4, it actually says, But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, It is enough now, O Lord, to take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Elijah had gotten to a point where he was questioning whether or not life was even worth living. And we're not told what exactly was going on in Elijah's head that time, but I think we can kind of see where this is going with him. It appears like everything is going right. Things are going to work out. We have won. God has won this great victory. And then just like that, by tomorrow you're going to be dead. Have I really made any difference? Have I really done anything, God? Elijah was having a very rough time with this. And like I'm sure many of us, in probably very different situations than this, have had those days where you're having a very rough time with something. But what's really interesting is, as we continue to read, we see God's answer. Because God has an answer for Elijah. What was God's answer? Let's read verses 5 through 8. This, talking about Elijah. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. The first thing God tells Elijah to do is take care of yourself. As Christians, we often make the mistake. We think of ourselves as physical beings that have a spiritual side. Well, that's actually backwards. What we are is spiritual beings who have a physical side, but we can't forget we have a physical side. God has created us as humans with basic needs, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the basic needs that we have is rest and food. We need to take care of ourselves. Our bodies do not function well if we do not take care of ourselves. That's sort of the lowest common denominator in the terms of our needs. We need rest and we need sleep. Do you ever know of anyone that doesn't take care of themselves? Maybe somebody who takes care of everybody else and doesn't take care of themselves? A lot of times we call that person mom. Because a lot of times, that is something that sometimes ladies deal with. We need to remember as husbands, as children, they're people too. Our moms are people too, and sometimes they need a break. Moms, sometimes you need to take care of yourself. It's okay to take care of yourself. That's what Elijah had forgotten here. Elijah had forgotten that it was okay to take care of himself. We see actually the same thing in the New Testament in 1 Timothy. In 1 Timothy 5:23, Paul has to actually tell Timothy, take care of yourself. You need not to let yourself get run down, get sick, not be well. We need to physically take care of ourselves. That's the first step. But that's not the only step. Because God has another answer for Elijah. Beginning at verse 9, we read, There he came to a cave, again talking about Elijah, and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, And a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek to take my life, to take it away." Now we're going to talk here in a bit about what God tells him. But the first thing we need to notice, we need to listen to God. When times are tough, we need to listen for God. God's not always going to be there in all the noise. I think that's what this passage is telling us. God wasn't there in the earthquake. God wasn't there in the thunder and the lightning. Elijah had to listen for God. Sometimes we can get so wrapped up in our own problems that we forget to listen to God. In Isaiah, the 55th chapter, verse 3, and actually I believe there's a word missing up there. It should be, "Incline your ear to me and come to me, hear, that your soul might live." We need to listen for God. As I was thinking about this point, I thought about Acts 16. Remember in Acts 16, Paul and Silas are in prison. They have been beaten and thrown in prison because they healed a little girl. That's problems. That's a bad day. They are in the innermost prison of a Roman prison. And what are they doing? They're singing at midnight. Why were Paul and Silas able to sing in a prison? Because they weren't focusing on the prison. Their thoughts weren't on the prison. Their thoughts were on God. And sometimes we can forget where our priorities are. Life gets hard and we get down and everything's coming in on top of us and we forget about God. But Elijah didn't just listen to God. God actually had an answer for him. God had something for Elijah to do. He actually, in verse 15 through 17 says, "And the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death." What God basically told Elijah was, you have a job to do. I'm not done with you yet. Elijah, you might want to curl up in a ball over here and die, but I have things for you to do. And as I think about this, the thought that immediately came to me is, what's our job? What's our job as a Christian? And I started thinking about all the different ways I could go with that. And if this was a Bible class instead of a sermon, I'd just open it up. And we got a pretty smart crowd here. I'm sure you'd come up with a really good list of things that are our job as a Christian. So I started doing a little research, and I came up with a list that I found a list on the internet that this gentleman had put together. And I liked it because I thought it was simple and succinct, but it did cover a lot. This man said, as a Christian, we basically have 3 jobs. Our first job is to exist as aliens. In 1 Peter 2:11, we're told that we are sojourners and exiles. And I was thinking about this, and I never really thought of this verse this way. Because I had always thought of this verse as, because of who we are, this is how we're going to be. What this gentleman making the point is we have to strive to be that. We have to be different. We sing the song, "This world is not my home." Well, do we really believe that? Do we really live like we don't belong here? Because you know what? It's real easy to belong. It's a whole lot simpler to just fit in and not make waves. No, one of our jobs is to be different. One of our jobs is to be sojourners and exiles in this land. Our second job is to fight as soldiers. Now, we are told, of course, we all know that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We're not actually physically fighting. Excuse me. But we are told in Ephesians 6 to put on the armor of God. There is a sense in which we are in a battle. And we not only have to be in that battle, we have to prepare for that battle. If you were here just a little bit ago when we had our Bible class, that's part of preparing for that battle. That's part of putting on that armor and being ready to fight. Because there's actually two things there. Not only do you have to fight the fight, you have to prepare to. And that's part of our job as a Christian, is to be ready to stand up and to fight that battle. Thirdly, our job is to represent as ambassadors. In 1 Peter 2:12, we are told to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. This is the same thing as when we talk about letting our light shine. I mean, we talked just a little bit ago about being sojourners and exiles in this land. This land isn't our home. We have a better land. But you know what? Our king isn't here now. Who's going to represent him? There's an old song, I'm not sure if it's in our new books or not, with the line that says, "You are the only Bible the world may ever read." That's the idea of being an ambassador. That's the idea of when people look at you, do they see Christ? That's part of our job. Part of our job is to be Jesus' ambassador in this land where we don't really belong. But we have to represent Jesus here. Excuse me. And then finally, God has one more answer for Elijah. In verse 18, he tells him, this is God speaking to Elijah, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." What God told him is, remember, you're not alone. In a lot of ways, this seems to me, and perhaps it's just me, this seems almost the most important point to make. When life gets hard, you need to remember you're not alone. In Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, this is describing God's kingdom. It says, "Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord." Does that sound like a place where you should ever feel alone? When a place where you are joined together, does that sound like a place where you should ever feel like you're alone? There's a reason why in the Bible we see the church described as a family. We are brothers and sisters. And sometimes in our society, we kind of lose what that term means because there's a whole lot of families that aren't what they shouldn't be. God's family should be what it is, what it should be. There are people here that care about you. If you are here this morning and you are hurting, there are people here who care about you. We are a family here, and we care for each other. That's what we do as Christians. So it sounds pretty simple. Those are the 4 points that God has given him. That's the 4 things that Elijah has told, or God has told Elijah, But perhaps you're sitting here this morning and you think, well, that sounds really good, but it sounds like everything you're saying is sort of geared towards people that are already Christians. It's sort of geared towards people who are already in the family. And in a sense it is. This has not been a sermon that really reaches out as much as looks in. But I would be remiss, as I was thinking about this lesson and I was thinking about the invitation and how we can offer the Lord's invitation, there was a verse that came to mind that I think fits. In Matthew, the 11th chapter, verses 28 through 30, this is a passage that most of us know. This is a passage that a lot of people who don't have much to do with Christ know. It's a popular passage. It says, "Come unto me, all ye who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Here we see Jesus looking out over this crowd of people and saying, "Come unto me, all ye who are weary and are heavy laden." Now, that's not a real complicated verse. There's not a lot of breaking down you need to do to understand that passage. But unfortunately, a lot of us, a lot of times, people read that verse, but instead what they think is, "Come unto me, all ye who've got it all figured out, who've already got your life cleaned up and fixed, and then you can join this group of perfect people that come to church every Sunday." And that's how sometimes the church is viewed. That's not what Jesus said. Christians are not perfect people. Christians are people who have come to Christ because they are broken, because they are not perfect. If we were perfect, we wouldn't need Christ. But we do need Christ. Each and every one of us needs Christ because we are not perfect. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, you need Christ. You need Christ because of what He did for you, because of what He did for each and every one of us. If you're here this morning and you are a Christian and you're struggling, maybe some of the things that I've said this morning have hit pretty close to home. Maybe you need prayers. Maybe your struggling has led you away from God. Maybe you just need somebody to cry with. Maybe if there is anything at all that we can do for you here, we'd ask that you'd come while we stand and sing.